Welcome all, and we have been discussing the plastic garbage and what it means for a modern society, what it talks about modernity, and what is a third world nation like India positioned in this ontology of things. So, when we talk about governmental roots of modern ethnicity, Dipesh Chakrabarty writes, there is an Indian character in the satanic verses by Salman Rushdie, who says, and I imagine here the Indian shaking of the head and a heavy upper class Delhi accent. And I quote, battle lines are being drawn in India today, secular versus religious, the light versus the dark. Better you choose which side you are on. Unquote. It is precisely this choice that I am going to refuse in this analysis. I want to explore instead some of the complex and unavoidable links that exist in Indian history between the phenomenon of ethnic conflict and the modern governing practices that the British introduced in India as the historical bearers of Enlightenment rationalism. This is not an argument against liberal values or against the idea of modernity as such, but shadows fall between the abstract values of modernity and the historical process through which the institutions of modernization come to be built. It is true that at this moment there do not seem to be any practical alternatives to the institutions of capitalism and the modern state in India. In all our actions, we must take into account their reality, that is, their theoretical claims as well as the specific histories through which they have developed in India. But it is, nevertheless, important that we create an Archimedean point, at least in theory, in order to have a longer term perspective on our problems. Today, understanding of what is practical need not constitute our philosophical horizon. If we let it do so, we submit even inside our heads to what already exists. The short review that I shall present here of the history of modern governmental practices in India is offered in the spirit of a dictum by a great thinker of the European Enlightenment. In reproducing it, I reverse the order of his statement. Obey, but argue as much as you want and about what you want. If a pristine form of liberalism, the Indian word is secularism, is one danger besetting the analysis of contemporary racism in India, the other danger is that of Orientalism. Sometimes indistinguishable from claims that India can be understood only on Indian or better Hindu terms. The possibility that the current conflicts in India between Hindus and Muslims or between the upper and the lower castes may be, in a significant sense, a variant of the modern problem of ethnicity or race is seldom entertained in discussions of the Western media, both Hinduism and caste being seen, not altogether unreasonably, as particular to the subcontinent. Even serious and informed scholars are not immune to the tendency. Klaus Klostermeyer's knowledgeable survey of Hinduism, published from New York in 1989, warns us against understanding Hindu politics on anything but Hindu terms. Political Hinduism, I hold, cannot be understood by applying either a Western Party democratic gauge or a Marxist socialist pattern. Its potential has much to do with the temper of Hinduism, which was able throughout the ages to rally people around causes that were perceived to be of transcendent importance, in whose pursuit ordinary human values and considerations had to be abandoned. Even when the problems are placed in an international framework, as in some passages of V.S. Naipaul's recent India, a Million Mutineers Now, what one gets is a patronizing pat on the back, a view of history somewhat reminiscent of what Hegel said about India in his lectures on the philosophy of history. Hegel wrote, and I quote, Hindu political existence presents us with a proper but no state, with a people, and this for Hegel meant the worst kind of despotism and a necessary absence of history. Hegel writes, it is because the Hindus have no history in the form of annals or historia that they have no history in the form of transactions. There is no growth expanding into the veritable political condition. Naipaul's egalitarianism is neither conscious nor sophisticated. It simply reproduces the idea that an awakening to history is the condition for democracy. For him, therefore, all the ethnic ferment in the Indian scene is simply a sign of the youth of India's historical consciousness. With time will come, with maturity, that nations with an older sense of their history presumably possess. To awaken to history is to cease to live instinctively. It was to begin to see oneself and one's group the way the outside world saw one, and it was to know a kind of rage. India was now full of this rage. There had been a general awakening, but everyone awakened first to his own group or community. Every group thought itself unique in its awakening, and every group sought to separate from this rage of other groups. Within India, too, the same law of oversight rules, for racism is thought of as something that the white people do to us. What Indians do to one another is variously described as communalism, regionalism, and casteism, but never as racism. There are, of course, particularly Indian twists to this story, and it is also true that modern racism, properly speaking, has social Darwinist connotations and should not be conflated with ethnic prejudice. Yet, for me, the popular word racism has the advantage of not making India look peculiar. A relative of mine wanting to sell a plot of land near Calcutta was recently told by the local communist leaders that he could indeed sell his land but not to Muslims. How is that any different, I would want to know, from an English landlady asking, on being told on the phone the name of the prospective tenant? Is that a Jewish Khan or a Pakistani Khan? Both varieties being, to the landlady's mind, at least undesirable. In focusing on the theme of contemporary Indian ethnic intolerance, I will argue that the experiment of nation making in India shows how modern problems of ethnicity cannot be separated from modern means of government and communication. My emphasis, in other words, will be on the way in which the development of a modern public political life in India has called into being constructions of both Hinduism and caste that do not admit of such simple binary distinctions as Salman Rushdie's character involves. For example, secular slash religious, liberal slash fundamentalist, nationalist slash communal. But first, let me try to anticipate and forestall a few misunderstandings. It is not my intention to deny the traditions of violence that existed in India before British rule. There are recorded instances of Hindu Muslim tensions during the pre colonial period. Historians and anthropologists are agreed that the Brahminic claim to ritual supremacy was seldom accepted without challenging by other social groups, including those whom we know as the untouchables. Citing examples from the period between the 7th and the 12th centuries of Hindu sects, destroying Buddhist and Jaina monasteries and sometimes killing the monks, the eminent historian Romila Thapar has usefully reminded us that the popular belief that the Hindus never indulged in religious persecution is simply untrue. This ancient history is something that I neither discuss nor deny in this essay, for my point is different. Something has fundamentally changed about both Hinduism and caste since British rule and particularly since the beginning of the 20th century. The change can be crudely but simply described using the example of caste. We know from anthropologists and historians of the so called caste system that there were no strong systematic rules guiding caste identity. This could be a matter of negotiation between individuals and groups. Marriage rules and rules of commensality could change within one's own lifetime or over generations, depending on factors such as social, economic, and geographic mobility. In other words, caste society operated as a non standardized system, and rules guiding caste transactions would have required a sensitivity to context. Just as the British sought to give India a standardized legal system, they also attempted to fix and officialize collective identities such as caste and religion in the very process of creating a quasi modern public sphere in India. The concept and the institutions that make up the public sphere, a free press, voluntary associations, avenues for uncensored debate and inquiry in the public interest are modern Europe's intellectual and practical gifts to the people whom they considered less fortunate than themselves and at whose doors they arrived as civilizing imperialists. My point is that modern problems of Hinduism and caste are inseparable from the history of this modern public life in India, which the British instituted and the nationalists preserved in what they sought were the best interests of the country. See, modern governmental practices in India, if we talk about the brief history, British rule in India lasted from 1757 to 1947, a little short of 200 years. The most fundamental and far reaching innovation that the British introduced to Indian society was, in my view, the modern state, not a nation state. For that was what the nationalist movement created, but a modern state nevertheless. One symptom of its modernity was that its techniques of government were very closely tied to techniques of measurement. From surveys of land and crop output to prospecting for minerals, from measuring Indian brains on behalf of the false science of phrenology to measuring Indian bodies, diets, and lifespans, thus laying the foundations of physical anthropology and modern medicine in India. The British had the length and breadth of India, its history, culture, and society mapped, classified, and quantified in detail that was nothing but precise, even when it was wrong headed. The most dramatic examples of this governmental concern with measurement were the decennial or decennial Indian censuses. Very importantly, the first of which was published in 1872. Since the British did not go to India in search of pure knowledge, all these studies were produced in the cause and in the process of governing India. And it is this pervasive marriage between government and measurement that I take as something that belongs to a deep structure of the imagination that is invested in modern political orders. Without numbers, it would be impossible to practice bureaucratic or instrumental rationality. This is not to say that pre-modern government had no use for numbers. The Mughals gathered statistics on produce, land, and revenue, among other things. William the Conqueror ordered the survey that resulted in the Doomsday Book. Historians of demography talk about ancient censuses conducted in such distant and disparate places as China, Rome, the word census itself being the Latin origin, and Peru, but this information was on the whole haphazardly collected and seldom updated with any regularity. The systemic collection of statistics in detail and in specific categories for the purpose of ruling seems to be intimately tied to modern ideas of government. The history of the very discipline of statistics carries this tale. The word statistic has, etymologically speaking, the idea of statecraft built into it. The shorter Oxford Dictionary tells us that in early use, statistics was the branch of political science dealing with the collection, classification, and discussion of facts bearing on the condition of a state or community. Gottfried Achenwall, who, as Ian Hacking informs us, was the first to coin the word statistics, intended it to imply a collection of remarkable facts about the state. While the census itself is an old idea, the first modern census was, according to some scholars, taken in the United States in 1790 and the first British census in 1801. The Indian censuses were not to appear until late in the 19th century. But the East India Company caused quite a few regional censuses to be taken before that period. So, measurement is central to what we call our modern ideas about fairness and justice. And you see how we administer them. In short, to the very idea of good government. Foucault has emphasized in several places, especially in his essay, say, on governmentality, how this has been critically dependent on the emergence of the problem of population in the 18th century, and therefore connected to the development of the other important science of the same period, that of economics. Benthamite attempts to use law for social engineering, the idea, for instance, that punishment should be in proportion to the crime committed, or the utilitarian aim of devising a society that maximizes the pleasure of the maximum number of people, all speak a language borrowed from mathematics and the natural sciences. Not surprisingly, given the connection between Enlightenment rationalism and scientific paradigms, the 1790 American census had to do with the idea of proportionality in the sphere of political representation. Ideas of correspondence, proportionality, and so on mark Rousseau's thoughts on equality. Without them, and without the numbers that they produced, the equal opportunity legislation of our own period would be unworkable. A generalized accounting mindset is what seems to inhabit modernity. As the representatives and the inheritors of the European Enlightenment, the British brought these ideas to India. It is, in fact, one of the ironies of British history that the British became political liberals at home at the same time as they became imperialists abroad. British policy in India was forever haunted by this contradiction. While the British would not grant India full self government until 1947, they were often concerned about being fair to the different competing sections that, in their view, made up Indian society. Sections that they had identified early on the basis of religion and caste. A count made of the population of Bombay in 1780, for instance, divided the population into socio religious communities. In the 18th century, British amateur historians often portrayed India as a society weakened by its internal religious and caste divisions, an understanding shared later on by Indian nationalists themselves. Understandably, then, categories of caste and religion dominated the censuses that the British undertook in India. At every census, people were asked to state their religion and caste, in marked contrast, as the American historian Kenneth Jones has pointed out, to what the British did at home. Religion, says Jones, was never an important category in the censuses conducted in Britain during the period between 1801 and 1931. Only once in 1851 were the British asked about the religious affiliation, and answering the question was optional. Counting Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, untouchables then became a critical political exercise, particularly in the 20th century as the British began to include Indian representatives in the country's legislative bodies in very measured doses. So, what made the census operations critical was that in trying to be fair referees, the British made the process of political representation communal. Seats in the legislative assemblies were earmarked for different communities according to ideas of proportionality. Nationalists like Nehru and Gandhi abhorred this process and the ideology that governed it, namely communalism, a word that still leads a stigmatized existence in India and works as a surrogate for racism. They pointed out, with some justice, that it was invidious to treat untouchables as a community separate from the Hindus. A language based definition of political communities would have seemed more natural to them, but post independence Indian history has shown that language is no surer a guide to ethnic identity and inter ethnic peace than is religion. Heads have, since the 1950s, been regularly broken in the subcontinent over linguistic issues. The liberation war of Bangladesh in 1971 being only a dramatic example of the process. Political leaders of the Muslims and untouchables, on the other hand, felt much happier going along with the British devised arrangements, until the final decade before independence and partition. Of particular importance in the Indian story is the category scheduled caste (SC), which the British coined in 1936 and the government of India has retained. So called because it referred to a schedule of particularly disadvantaged castes that was drawn up for the purpose of giving effect to the provisions of special electoral representation in the Government of Indian Act 1935. It represents a pioneering attempt at affirmative action. Historians and political scientists studying modern India have recently made several attempts to understand what happened to ethnic identities. Through this process of a quasi modern, albeit colonial, state instituting through modern means of measurement a structure of political representation tied to notions of proportionality. What, in other words, did the census do to identities? Historians and anthropologists of colonial India have reported a social process akin to what Ian Hacking calls dynamic nominalism. People came to fit the categories that the colonial authorities had fashioned for them. Hacking explains dynamic nominalism thus, and I quote: "You will recall that a traditional nominalist says that stars, or algae, or justice have nothing in common except our names. Stars, algae, justice. The traditional realist, in contrast, finds it amazing that the world could so kindly sort itself into our categories. He protests that there are definite sorts of objects in it, which we have painstakingly come to recognize and classify correctly. The robust realist does not have to argue very hard that people also come sorted. A different kind of nominalism, I call it dynamic nominalism, attracts my realist self, spurred on by theories about the making of the, say, homosexual and the heterosexual as kinds of persons, or by my observations about official statistics. The claim of dynamic nominalism is not that there was a kind of person who came increasingly to be recognized by bureaucrats or by students of human nature, but rather that a kind of person came into being at the same time as the kind itself was being invented. In some cases, that is, our classifications and our classes conspire to emerge hand in hand, each egging the other on. And I unquote. The Indian political scientist Sudipto Kobiraj has pursued a similar argument with regard to the history of communities in pre-British and British India. In pre-British India, says Kaviraj, communities had fuzzy boundaries. In British India, they became enumerated. By fuzzy, Kaviraj means vague boundaries that do not admit of discrete either or divisions. Census or official enumerations, however, give us discrete kinds of identities, even if particular identities change, as indeed they often do over time. For the purpose of affirmative action, a scheduled caste person is a scheduled caste person is a scheduled caste person. So we can remember the poem that a rose is a rose is a rose. So for the purpose of affirmative action, a scheduled caste person is a scheduled caste person is a scheduled caste person. The distinction that Kaviraj draws is parallel to one that Hacking draws in his attempt to find a path somewhere between the epistemological obstinacies of the nominalist and the realist positions. It will be foolhardy to have an opinion about one of the stable human dichotomies, male and female, but very roughly, the robust realist will agree that there may be what really are physiological borderline cases, once called hermaphrodites. The existence of vague boundaries is normal. Most of us are neither tall nor short, fat nor thin. Sexual physiology, the categorical structure of sexual physiology is unusually abrupt in its divisions. The kernel of Kaviraj's argument is that the post Enlightenment governing practices that the British introduced in India and that entailed counting collective identities in an all or nothing manner enabled people to see and organize themselves in the light of these categories. I shall quote here at some length Koviraj's own gloss on these terms, as all my knowledge of Indian history as well as my lived experience of India compel me to agree with him. Koviraj writes, communities were fuzzy in two senses. Rarely, if ever, would people belong to a community which would claim to represent or exhaust all the layers of their complex selfhood. Individuals on suitable occasions could describe themselves as Vaishnavas. Bengalis are more likely Radhis, Kshatriyas, villagers, and so on. And clearly, although all this could, on appropriate occasions, be called their Samaj, society, or community, their boundaries would not coincide. Their identity would be fuzzy in a second sense as well. To say their community is fuzzy is not to say it is imprecise. On the appropriate occasion, every individual would use his cognitive apparatus to classify any single person he interacts with and places him quite exactly, and decide if he could eat with him, go on a journey, or arrange a marriage into his family. It was therefore practically precise and adequate to the scale of social action. But it would not occur to an individual to ask how many of them there were in the world and what if they decided to act in concert. I would like to modify Koviraj's incisive analysis in one respect. However, the movement from fuzzy to enumerated communities did not represent a complete change of consciousness. In their everyday lives, in negotiating the spheres of friendship and kinship, say Indians, like human beings everywhere, are comfortable with the indeterminacies of ethnic identities and share none of the tendency or tenacity with which social scientists and governments hang on to the levels that inform their sense of both analysis and action. Yet, the very existence of administrative categories of ethnicity, whether one is looking at the international level or at developments within a country, suggests a modern public carriers for ethnic tags, a national identity being its highest form. It is, of course, within this sphere that the identity of being Indian or Hindu or Muslim or scheduled caste takes on a new political meaning. This meaning resides alongside, as is interlaced with, the more fuzzy sense of community. The late 19th century censuses and other similar institutions then reconstituted the meaning of community or ethnicity and gave Indians three important political messages, all of which are entirely compatible with liberal political philosophy as we know it. These messages were one, that communities can be enumerated and that in numbers lies political cloud. Number two, that the social and economic progress of community can be measured in the case of Indian censuses in terms of share in public life, say for education, the professions, employment, etc. And number three, that this enables governments and communities to devise objective tests for the relative backwardness or otherwise of a community. Indians were quick to learn the art of participation in this public sphere. They learned as well as do when we want to take advantage of equal opportunity legislation that modern governments have limited intelligence and their principles of distributive justice requires simple, homogeneous, sharply delineated identities, the kinds that passports bear, while identities can proliferate and have a tendency to do so under the pressure of the politics of democratic representation. The sense of multiple identities that propels individuals in their everydayness is too complex for the rule that govern the logic of representation in modern public life, where identities, however numerous and internally differentiated they may be, must each remain distinct and discrete in the competitive race for goods and services that the state and civil society may offer. It is this pressure, which is essentially the pressure that modern political orders produce, that led many Indian leaders to profess simplistic, homogeneous ethnic identities in public life. disregarding all the heterogeneity and diversity of Indian social practices. These were categories by which few leaders actually lived their private lives. When we look back now at India in the 1870s and 1880s, it becomes clear that the era of modern, competitive, governmentally defined ethnic identities familiar to us in liberal democracies had already arrived. The peculiarity of colonial Indian history lay in the fact that these identities were based on religious categories because of a certain degree of reification of these categories by the British. But even if the British had picked language as a mark of distinction in this multilingual country, the result would have been the same. So by the 1890s, Hindu and Muslim leaders were quoting census figures at each other to prove whether they had received their legitimate share of benefits such as employment and education from British rule. The rise of modern caste consciousness shows a similar concern for the measurement of progress in public life. The famous anti Brahman manifesto, produced in Madras in 1916 by members of the non Brahman caste in forming a new political party, owed its rhetorical force to the statistics that the government had collected to demonstrate a Brahman monopoly of the civil services. Demography was pressed into the service of such ethnic jealousies between Hindus and Muslims or between castes by several authors who used to censuses to make their points. One example of this process, discussed by Kenneth Jones, is a set of articles published by a Bengali author, U.N. Mukherjee, in 1909, a time in Indian history when the Muslims were being given reserved seats in the legislature by the British. In this series entitled A Dying Race, Mukherjee used the census data from the period 1872 to 1901 to demonstrate to the satisfaction of many Hindus that within a given number of years all Hindus would disappear from British India. In doing this, writes Jones, Mukherjee was actually following the lead of M.J.C. O'Donnell, Census Commissioner of Bengal for 1891, who had calculated the number of years it would take the Hindus to altogether disappear from Bengal if Mohammedan increase went on at the rate it was doing. Now let us put aside for the moment what to our ears may sound racist in these remarks. My point is that the social assumptions on which the classification and organization of census figures rested were fundamentally modern. They showed India to be a collection of communities whose progress or backwardness could be measured by the application of some supposedly universal index. That is exactly how modern world of nation states is structured. It is a united but internally hierarchized world where some countries are described as measurably, or should I say immeasurably, more advanced than others. This structure of relations has the nature of what scientists call fractals or semi similar patterns. It is capable of reproducing itself at many different levels between nations, between modern ethnic groups, between perceived races, and so on. It is what constitutes the liberal idea of competitive pluralism. As a French historian, Lucien Fabre once reminded us, as an idea, it has been with us since the second half of the 18th century. It was packed into the idea of civilization, a word that the French started to use in the 1760s and that soon found its way into the English language to provide the noblest justification for England's work in India. The word civilization has long since fallen out of favor. We prefer to talk about progress in the 19th century and development in the 20th, but the idea of a united world with an internally articulated hierarchy measurable by some universally agreed on index or indices that remained with us. How strongly the Indian middle classes internalized this idea suggested by the following quotation from a Bengali book of morals that was published in Calcutta about 140 years ago by consumption by children. Noticed how the world is seen as both one and hierarchic, the observable differences in standards of living between countries being to make a conscious gesture towards the idea of measurement proportional to their total national efforts. Countries where people are averse to labor are uncivilized. The Aboriginals of America and Australia, as well as the Negroes, are still in this state. They live in great hardship without adequate food and clothes, and they do not save anything for bad times. The Germans, the Swiss, the French, the Dutch, and the English are the most industrial nations or races, jati of the world. That is why they enjoy the best circumstances among all nations. Use of such language today would be offensive, but there is a homology between what these children's primer said and the sensibility that makes the of the modern industrialized nations a model for the rest of the world to follow. We all partake of this sensibility, and I am no exception. All I am saying is that this sensibility, what we hold to be common sense with respect to these matters, is undergirdled by the mechanisms of the modern state and the universal requirement of governmentality. The same mechanisms that influence are constructions of competitive blocks of ethnicity in the public sphere. Hindus, Muslims, the scheduled, and the lower castes of India, both during and after the British rule, have in a sense done no more than apply this sensibility to their public political lives. So now comes the very important discussion: ethnicity and slash or the nation. So ethnicity or nation, or ethnicity and nation, an ironic perspective. But of course, they have done more than that. Where India is simply a place where ethnicity is contained within the liberal structure of competitive pluralism, it would not have made news, and I would not be discussing it today. Ethnic strife in India has resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands in the past 100 years. Recent skirmishes in Assam, Punjab, and Kashmir have been particularly deadly. What then is the difference between the recent Western and contemporary Indian experience of ethnicity? What is the difference, or what the difference? This came to me forcefully in 1989 when I received a form letter from the Australian Prime Minister encouraging me to become the Australian citizen. In that letter, the Prime Minister went on to take to some trouble to spell out what it means to be an Australian. It is not the color of your skin or your religion or the language that you speak that makes you an Australian, he said. It is believing in freedom of speech, in freedom of association, in everyone having a fair go, etc. This letter prompted me to subject myself to some imaginary tortures of the Geoffrey Robertson kind. For example, I asked myself, if this is all there is to being an Australian, then what would be my proper patriotic response if Australia ever went to war with a nation that professed the same liberal values but was much better equipped to protect them, and hence, by definition, to protect my Australianness as well? Of course, a Margaret Thatcher would argue that a liberal democratic country would never start a war, and that the question is therefore moot. A little reflection made it clear that the Prime Minister was speaking in a historical context that afforded him one rare luxury. He felt no pressure to spell out what made Australians different from other people. The letter was, by implication, relegating cultural difference to the sphere of the personal. If pressed, a liberal would no doubt tell me that as the British Muslims who burned the satanic verses at Bradford were often reminded, ethnicity can find a place in public life so long as its expressions is in conformity with the core values of a nation as defined by the state. Ethnicity functions here under the aegis of equal opportunity principles in the form of a pressure group, in my case, an Indian association that demands things like time slots on Australian public radio or funding for community schools as part of liberal pluralist multiculturalism. As Talal Asad has shown in his discussion on the Rusdi affair, There are hidden demographic assumptions behind this position, particularly that of a continuous dominance of a European derived, if not an English speaking majority. Of course, one must also take into account particular Australian institutions, the welfare state, a relatively prosperous economy, a structure of the Australian Liberal Party, the official policy of multiculturalism, etc., that have historically played a role in managing ethnic conflict in public life. That Australia would be able to retain this multicultural tolerance of ethnicity in public life, in the cultural dominance of its Anglo Celtic or at least European majority, were ever seriously threatened, is far from certain. Modern ethnic consciousness in India have been fashioned under circumstances in which the politics of cultural difference has been of preeminent value. See, the question of Indian unity has never been settled beyond a doubt or disputation, nor has there been any one culturally homogeneous and dominant majority ethnic group that could both dominate and effectively claim to represent all Indians, at least until independence. One might argue that the Hindu extremist party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, has been trying to develop such a position for itself, precisely by denying the heterogeneity that characterizes Hinduism. The British cobbled a political India together for reasons of administrative convenience. The nationality question was muddled from the beginning. In the public sphere that the British created, there was no one universally agreed on Indian ethnicity. The struggle to produce a sense of cultural unity against the British made the mainstream Indian nationalism culturally Hindu. The Muslim search for Pakistan emphasized Islam. The lower castes' struggle for social justice produced anti Brahmanism. So, after independence in the 1950s and the 1960s, there were the tribal communities of the Nagas and the Mizos on the northeastern frontier of the country that had to be bludgeoned into becoming Indian. The past 15 or 20 years have seen an explosive combination of democracy and demography. The Indian population has almost trebled since independence. The growth and diversity of the middle class may be judged from the fact that while at independence there was consensus that the number of important languages was 14, there are now daily newspapers published in more than 70-80 languages. This middle class has tasted consumerism, and the result has been an increased sense of competition in urban life. Thus, secessionist movements in Kashmir and parts of the northeast have gained in strength in recent years. Caste, particularly the Indian policy of positive discrimination in favor of the lower castes, has often been an extremely contentious issue in public life. And the latest attempts by the extremist Hindu political parties to convert Hinduism into a strong, monolithic, and militant religion have given many Indian Muslims and Christians understandable pause. Like the former Soviet Union, India remains in part, although only in part, an imperial structure held together by strong tendencies towards centralism. Unlike the former Soviet Union, however, those centralist tendencies exist within and must work through a democratic political structure that also gives the state more popular legitimacy and unity than the Stalinist states ever had. Indians have an investment in electoral democracy, as was proved by the acute popular resentment of the emergency declared by Mrs. Gandhi during the period 1975 to 77. Yet the ideological scene has changed. This centralizing tendency was most powerfully expressed in the ideology of Jawaharlal Nehru, which represented some kind of consensus among the political elite. This ideology, called in India secularism, drew heavily on the Western liberal heritage to argue for a separation between religion and the ideas that governed public life. In India, where a religious idiom and imagination had always been very strongly present, this ideology never described the actual culture of political practice. But so long as the national leadership lay in the hands of a tiny elite reared and respectful to the British traditions of politics, the everyday religiousness of Indian political culture could be kept separate from the decision making boards of the government. The custodial nature of this elite was reflected in the unity of the Congress party, in which Nehru always remained a Bonapartist figure. The combination of democracy, and political growth in India has ensured that the political elite is no longer tiny. There are no Bonapartist figures in India today. Nehruvian secularism, a close cousin of Western liberalism, represented now by Marxists and left liberals in India, are on the defensive. Remember Salman Rushdie's character talking about the battle lines? Why this has happened will require a different analysis, but it should be clear from the preceding discussion that the problem of competitive and official constructions of ethnicity is a feature inherent in modern civil society. In the best of times, one expects to find lawful, bureaucratic means of resolving these tensions. Even then, the mobilization of ethnic sentiments always risks spilling over into racism in public places, as widely reported incidents of harassment of the Australian Muslims during the Gulf War would confirm. There are, however, other times in history where bureaucratic solutions lose their appeal. The difference here is not due to a total opposition between fascism and liberalism as a political philosophies. The difference here is a historical context. Imagine the conflict between the Bengali Muslim sense of ethnicity and Pakistani nationalism in what was before 1971 East Pakistan. Clearly, a model of pluralism that recommended that all signs of cultural difference be matters of private belief became untenable in that situation. Kashmir today represents for many a similar situation. The point is that, as I have argued, the very structure of modern governmentality carries with it the seeds of competitive constructions of ethnicity. Whether those seeds will ever germinate and bloom and bloody conflicts spring forth is a matter of the particular moment of history that one inhabits. This is not a counsel of despair, but it is a plea for our political analysis to be informed by a larger sense of irony. Advocating the cultivation of a sense of irony about the civilizing narratives of modernity does not imply political passivity. The relation between philosophical positions and political action is seldom straightforward. Not only is there no alternative to action, we are condemned to act politically in this world whether we want to or not. But the subject who acts and is mobilized to act in the face of events is also more than an intellectual philosophical subject. Action involves emotions, memories, tastes, feelings, wills, and values. And these things have histories over which we have much less control than we have over our consciously thought out philosophical positions. So, yes, actions have emotions, and we have taste, feelings, and values that have evolved historically. But we have our conscious, positions of well thought philosophical positions. True, I have been irreversibly conditioned by the histories of my childhood, my education, and my socialization, all influenced by British and nationalist critiques of Indian society, to be revolted to such practices of sati, female infanticide, human sacrifice, and thuggy, to use the names by which British colonial discourse described, always inaccurately, and condemned Indian, yet another name, civilization. So, wherever my theoretical understanding today of their problematic histories, how in that mode of action this revolution or this revulsion will express itself depends on particular situations and the opportunities that I read them as presenting. What then is the relation between this critique and political or state policies that might be established to combat racism under conditions of modernization? First, this critique is about the limits of policy making under present institutional arrangements. I have argued that given the connection between governmentality and measurement, both the modern nation state and civil society necessarily set up certain competitive structures of identity through the very distributive process over which they preside. The question, distribution among whom, always takes identities for granted. Identities here are not seen as porous. In fact, identities are not measurable or enumerable except on the assumption that their boundaries are abrupt and not vague. In the language of distributive justice, identities represent at any one point of time some kind of narrative consensus in which everybody or every group knows who or what they are, and this knowledge is shared by the institution that administers well-being. So, in other words, the existing models of modern political and economic institutions handle the question of cultural difference in identity precisely by fixing and freezing differences into divisions that are not permeable. A Hindu cannot be a Muslim, and thus are amenable to measurement and enumeration. Even if we moved from this idea of allocative justice to that of procedural justice in the sphere of distribution, as John Rawls did in his classic A Theory of Justice, we would still have no way of handling differences in identities. So, Rawls' search for justice as fairness, as readers of that famous text will know, led him to posit an original position, a perspective position, really, as he himself explains, in which individuals met without any conception of their social or class locations, that is to say, as humans from whom all differences had been abstracted away. So, even leftist intellectuals who try to modify Rawls' arguments in or uh, in order to infuse a more self-consciously political life into his theory find it difficult not to universalize a distinction that is historically very particular, that is the distinction between public and private. Chantal Mouffe's attempt to move away from the Rawlsian position of holding on to the idea of an original rational agreement and instead to ground democracy in a permanent state of disputation. Since there can no longer be a single idea of substantial common good, is instructive in this regard. Pluralism here is seen as possible on the condition that the political is defined around a minimum shared agreement, that the principles of the liberal democratic regime qua political association, equality and liberty by be defined as the common political good. As Mouffe clarifies, a liberal democratic regime, if it must be agnostic in terms of morality and religion, cannot be agnostic concerning political values, since by definition it asserts the principles that constitute its specificity qua political association, the political principles of equality and liberty. Where then will be the place for morality and religion in this postmodern socialist idea of liberal democratic policies, one that accepts disputation as a foundation for democracy, or indeed for anything else that is not part of this minimum shared political good. Mouffe is clear on this. These ideas will exist as private belief, the sphere of privacy implicitly defined in such a way as to be incapable, by its very definition, by endangering the institutions that embody the political principles of equality and liberty. What else can intellectual thinking out of Indian history do but experience a sense of irony at what European political theory offers us? On the one hand, there are the actually existing institutions that administer our lives, both in India and outside. The very administration of ethnic identities by the actually existing civil political institutions needs, as I have shown, the same fixed, discrete categories that racists of all colors use. The only difference is an idiom. Bureaucracies use a certain impersonal, unemotional language, while racist mobilization in public life involves an explicit use of emotions as well. But this difference is superficial and depends on historical context. Governments will, in moments of crisis, use both. On the other hand, whether arguing from a purely liberal positions of Rawls or a postmodernist socialist position of a Mouffe, critics of these institutions cannot but resurrect the model of a human being who holds on to a cultural distinctions between the public and the private as a condition for tolerance and pluralism. But is this distinction universal? Is it universal even in the West? Does political emancipation, I borrow the expression from the young Marxist essay on the Jewish question, require us to universalize the experience and skills of a particular group in modern European history? Must we all become humans who are able to objectify their relation to the supernatural, the divine, or the netherworld into stateable beliefs, and who are able to categorize these beliefs as private. The politics of being human differ between and within cultures. We are not impervious to one another, but that does not mean that these differences are not real. Some people in India possess the modern sense of privacy as it has developed in the history of the middle classes in the West. Many do not. The importance of kinship in Indian society suggests other paths of social change. If we swallowed a theory, hook, line, and sinker, that made tolerance and pluralism contingent on the idea of private belief, we would only move farther away from our social realities than Rawls does from his by his theoretical maneuvering. So, the writing of Indian history then must subscribe to two struggles. One is to document and interpret for contemporary needs the different practices of toleration and pluralism that already exist in Indian society, practices that are not critically dependent on the universalization of the distinction private slash public. The other is to help develop critiques of already existing institutions and the theoretical assumptions that lay behind them, for the struggle against the murderous and self proclaimed Hindus of today must, in the long run, also be a struggle for new kinds of political and economic institutions for the management of public life. Institutions that do not require for their everyday operation the fiction of cultural identities with fixed, enumerable, and abrupt boundaries. Nobody has the blueprints for such institutions, although we do know that the two of the finest products of the Indo British cultural encounter of the 19th century, Gandhi and Tagore, experimented with both facets of this struggle at different moments of their lives. If cultural and other kinds of differences are to be taken and negotiated seriously, then we also need institutions that can handle the fuzzy logic with which identities are built. The existing institutions in charge of producing and administering prosperity do not do that. We have come to the end of our discussion. I thank you to stay till the end.